Hi, I'm Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. A question I've been receiving a fair amount lately comes from listing brokers, and the listing broker wants to know when they are approached by an unrepresented buyer, must they work with the unrepresented buyer? Can they say to the unrepresented buyer, I don't work with unrepresented buyers? And the answer to that question is no, you can't say that. You've been hired by the seller to market and sell the seller's property. And when you have an unrepresented buyer standing in front of you, you have a potential buyer standing in front of you. Your job on behalf of the seller is to sell that home. When you think about the antitrust allegations that our industry has wrestled with in the recent past, imagine what that unrepresented buyer would hear if you told them, you can't buy this house unless you go get representation. Now let's back up for a second, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with you suggesting, and in fact, you absolutely should advise the unrepresented buyer to get representation. Purchasing a home is, for most buyers, the singularly largest financial transaction they will ever encounter in their lives. And most buyers need representation, if not from a buyer broker, then from a lawyer. But if you have made that recommendation and the buyer says, no, I don't want to spend the money on a buyer broker, I want to represent myself, then you as the listing broker cannot say to them, I'm sorry, buyer, you can't buy this property unless you get representation. Because what you would be saying to them is this, buyer, unless you are willing to pay compensation to a colleague of mine, another industry member, then you cannot buy this home. This home is not available to you. Now, when you frame the issue in that context, and I know that's not what any listing broker who's asked me this question has on their mind, but that's really what a response would mean to a buyer if the listing broker said, I'm sorry, you can't buy this property unless you get representation. So listing brokers, when your job from the seller is to find a buyer for the seller's property, you don't get to put parameters around what that buyer looks like or whether that buyer is represented. You sell seller's property to the buyer who wants to purchase seller's property, even if they're unrepresented. Now, I understand the question that listing brokers ask because there can be a significant amount of liability that flows to a listing broker who assists an unrepresented buyer with the purchase of seller's property. Understand what that transaction is going to look like. There's only one broker involved in the transaction. So listing broker, you are going to write the offer. I'm sometimes asked, well, as a listing broker, should I just give blank forms, purchase and sale agreement forms to the buyer, let the buyer fill them out? Absolutely not. An unrepresented buyer is not trained in how to use the forms. You are. And so listing broker, you will write the purchase and sale agreement. But therein lies a fair amount of liability. The unrepresented buyer tells you the terms they want to offer. What if they don't tell you to include contingencies that would be typical to many buyers, most buyers even? If they say to you, I want to buy property, and you know that they would be well served by having a financing or inspection contingency in their offer, but they don't tell you they want to include a financing or an inspection contingency, can you suggest to them that they include a financing or inspection contingency? No, you can't. Why not? Because your unequivocal agency law duty in this transaction is to the seller. It's a duty of loyalty. You owe duties to both parties, but your duty of loyalty to the seller says you may take no action that's adverse or detrimental to seller's interests in the transaction. If you suggest to buyer that buyer include contingencies in the offer that they were not intending to include contingencies in, then have you taken an action that's adverse or detrimental to seller's interest in the transaction? Of course you have. So you can't do that. You can do this. You can write the buyer's offer exactly as they suggest to you they want it written. And then once they sign it, you present it to your seller. And as you present it to your seller, if you believe there's a benefit to the seller for the buyer having a contingency that the buyer didn't include, then you can give the seller good counsel around counter-offering the buyer's offer to include that contingency or contingencies. If you and the seller conclude that would be in the seller's best interest to do so. But when we talk about increased liability for the buyer, for the listing broker working with an unrepresented buyer, imagine that your seller does not want to include an inspection or a financing contingency for the unrepresented buyer whose offer doesn't include those. And so then we have mutual acceptance without those contingencies, and that buyer is unable to close because they can't get financing and they lose their earnest money. Does that increase the likelihood that you will receive a complaint from that buyer alleging that somehow or another you failed them by failing to advise them to include contingencies? You adhered to your agency law duties, but does that mean that you won't get sued or that you won't be the subject of a DOL complaint? Absolutely not. An angry buyer might make you the subject of a complaint. Or let's say that the transaction actually closes, and then after closing, the buyer learns something about the condition of the property that they should have learned from an inspection, but they didn't conduct an inspection because they didn't include an inspection contingency, and you as the seller's exclusive agent did not recommend that they include an inspection contingency. Might they complain about you at that point because you didn't recommend that they have an inspection contingency even though you weren't their agent? Of course, they might. You increase the chances of something like that happening. Buyer closes the transaction and then later regrets the price that they paid. Might they claim that the listing broker failed to accurately represent the value of the property and so they paid too much? Sure, that claim could exist. There's any number of potential liability points that could happen. None of this is even looking at the cost to the seller of a sale-failed transaction because the buyer was not prepared to purchase the property or didn't have adequate representation through the purchase process. Listing brokers, simply put, when you are approached by an unrepresented buyer, your job is to sell seller's home, even to a buyer who has no representation. So in this video, we've talked about some potential liability points for you. I'm not telling you that you're going to avoid that liability. I'm not telling you that you even can avoid that liability because your job is to sell the property even to that buyer. But I do want you to think about these issues. I want you to think about how you write an offer for an unrepresented buyer. One suggestion I've heard from some brokers, I think this is a fine suggestion. It might be right for you, it might not be right for you. Some listing brokers say, what I do in that scenario is I have the buyer give me all of their offer terms, and then I go talk to my seller, and my seller writes an offer for the buyer to consider in purchasing the property. So instead of me as a listing broker writing an offer for an unrepresented buyer to purchase my seller's property, we do it backwards. I tell the seller what the buyer's basic offer terms are, and then the seller and I write an offer that would be acceptable to the buyer. I deliver that to the buyer. I recommend that the buyer hire legal counsel or get representation to review that offer, but now it's up to the buyer to review the offer that the seller has presented to the buyer. Different way to approach it. If you think that that helps to reduce your liability, that might be what you want to do. Purpose of this video, I want you to think about these issues in advance. I don't want you to think about these issues for the first time when an unrepresented buyer comes to you as a listing broker. Have conversations about how you might approach some of these issues in your office so that you can be ready with answers when these scenarios come around. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please ask me a question by visiting warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.